Hi folks, this is Matt from the ranch. We're continuing on looking at Psalm chapter 63. And David goes on and he says, when I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches, speaking of God. And I'm going to tell you, that's why I got into this passage. I was kind of in a season in life where I wasn't sleeping at night. When I would go to bed, I was plenty tired. That wasn't an issue. I could fall asleep sitting in a chair. Even standing up was touch and go sometimes. But despite the fact that my eyes felt like they were burning out of my skull, my mind wouldn't go to bed. It wouldn't rest. And because it was concerned with the cares of the world. My mind was wrapped up in the things that I was responsible for, the people I was responsible to, and the people I was responsible for. And I would mull on things. And a good night's sleep fixes tired, but a good night's sleep doesn't fix weary. And I found myself very weary. So I was reading through this passage when that verse really jumped out at me. This idea of meditating on God in the night watches, remembering God while David's sleeping. In the midst of this crisis he's in, he's meditating on God. God consumes his thoughts. David talks about meditation in other passages too. In fact, in Psalm chapter 1, he says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night." Well, that's kind of encouraging, isn't it? David said there's only 2 times where we have to think about God, day and night, right? That our minds would be consumed with him. I heard it said once time that when our mind goes where it will go, where it goes to, as far as when our mind can wander to where it wants to wander to, where it wanders to reveals who we are or who we soon will become. What consumes our thoughts? Now, you may wonder why I've got Brisket with me. And this is Brisket, my longhorn steer. He's a 9-year-old, and we use him a lot in messages and things like that. He's a great steer, he really is. And the reason I brought him out is because as I go through my day, I want to think about God. Someone challenged me as a young man one time. They said, about learning to pray without ceasing. And I said, but I got that figured out. I pray all day long. The problem was my prayers were all centered on me and not on God and praising him or thinking on who he was. I thought about me and I thought about my circumstances. So when I go through my day, I look for those things that encourage me to consider who God is. Like you would think about looking up at the stars at night and saying, man, our God, he reveals himself through the heavens. Psalm chapter 19 tells us that. It declares the glory of who he is, that God breathed those stars into existence, that he measures that expanse of the universe with the span of his hand. I mean, that's our God. This time of year, we probably think about things because it's a change in season. And if you're in the part of the world where you have seasons, then you probably have those things that kind of remind you a change is coming. In our neck of the woods, sometimes it's the first robin. Sometimes it's the crocuses or the snowdrops kind of busting through the ground and starting to bloom. For me, there's 3 that I think of. One is red-winged blackbirds. When the red-winged blackbirds come to my bird feeder in my backyard, spring's coming. The other for me is the peepers that peep on the bog behind my house. When the peepers start up, spring must be coming. But the third one, if you work with livestock or anything that sheds, you can appreciate, and that's this. When springtime comes, all this fur that's been developing, or hair that's been protecting this steer all winter long, it's going to come off. And God's made him to work that way. And you get hair on everything. I'll give you just an example. He's been out in the field. So this is his first grooming of the spring. And you can see it just coming off in chunks. In fact, so much of it will come off when you're done, you'll have such a pile around them that you'll think you could all scrape it all together and make your own little steer, right? Well, while I look at that and realize that that's just a natural process that God put in place concerning this steer and concerning a change in season, he's not going to need that hair through the summer. That process actually started back in December. That process started when the days started changing and they started getting longer. It's just being revealed now. That brings me really great encouragement. In other words, God knew the need that would come and began the process for meeting that need before it was ever perceived. It gives me encouragement as we walk through the challenges of our current circumstances in life and season in life. God knows He's not surprised by it. In fact, it reminds me of a time I was traveling home. I delivered a horse and was on my way back home late at night. I was listening to the radio, and they were interviewing a woman. I don't recall what her name was, but she had been the personal assistant of Corrie ten Boom the last years of Corrie's life. And she'd written a book about that. And the interviewer asked the lady, he said, can you give me some insight into what it was like to live with Corrie, such a woman of faith, maybe something that's in the book or not in the book? And so this lady, she shared about a circumstance when they were in an airport. And it was her job to get Corrie to this certain speaking engagement. And by this point, Corrie was in a wheelchair, and an announcement came over the loudspeaker that their flight had been canceled. And so instantly this lady thinks, oh, what am I going to do, right? I've got to get her from point A to point B. This flight's been canceled. We're going to miss our connector. All these things are flooding her mind, but she hadn't said anything. And she said all of a sudden she just felt a hand on her arm. And she turned, and Corrie was looking at her and said, child, heaven is not surprised by any of this. The world we're living in right now, the challenges, the decisions, God's not surprised by any of it. He knows. And in this, we are also known. What fills our mind? What are the things that we think on? What do we meditate on? My wife Jenny's favorite verse, or one of them at least, is Isaiah chapter 26, where it says, but you will keep him in perfect peace when your mind is stayed on him because he trusts in him. In other words, when our mind is stayed on God because we trust in God. So my prayer for you, my prayer for me has been this, that we will be found faithful having our mind stayed on God. And when our mind can wander, may it wander to him.